The great hall of Ashford Park held its breath. Margaret stood at the far end of it, near the long windows that faced the west lawn, and she kept her hands still at her sides, because she had learned long ago that stillness was the only weapon a woman in her position was permitted to carry. The fire in the hall's wide hearth had been lit for the occasion, which meant Lady Cecily had ordered it, which meant Lady Cecily intended to be witnessed. Sir Neville Crabbe stood to the left of the fireplace in his good brown coat, his watch chain gleaming, his expression the particular expression of a man who has not yet been told he will not get what he came for. And at the hall's entrance, framed by the stone arch the parish had admired for 200 years, stood a man in a coat that fit him too well for what the world had taken him to be. Margaret had not yet looked at him directly. She was working up to it. She had looked at him a great deal over the preceding fortnight, in the kitchen garden, and in the rain on the upper path, and once in the estate library, with a borrowed coat folded between them on the table. She had simply not known during any of those moments what it was she was looking at. Now the courier's voice from the village square was still fresh in her ears, the easy address of a man who does not think before he speaks, because he has never needed to, and she understood at last what Mrs. Howell had known from the day he arrived, and she understood what the coat had meant when he returned it, and she understood, with the particular clarity that comes too late to be comfortable and too early to be entirely unwelcome, that she had been seen from the very beginning. It would help to go back to the beginning. Ashford Park had been empty for 3 years. That was what the parish believed. That was what the village of Compton Ashford believed, and the farms along the Wiltshire Road believed, and the Deering household, which occupied a rented property less than a mile from the estate's southern gate, believed with some confidence. The estate's owner, whoever he was, had gone abroad, and the great house had been left in the charge of its housekeeper and a reduced staff, and that was that. The grounds remained tended in a general way. The kitchen garden produced its cabbages and late parsnips without anyone to eat them. The library was kept aired, and the paths through the park, which were not precisely public, but had never been blocked, remained open for anyone sensible enough to walk them before supper. Margaret was very sensible. She had been walking the Ashford paths since she was a child, when her father was still alive, and still the solicitor who handled certain affairs of the estate's absentee stewardship, and she had continued walking them after his death 2 years ago, because they were the one place where Lady Cecily did not expect anything of her. Lady Cecily was not her mother. That distinction mattered. Her father had remarried when Margaret was 14, and the marriage had been, on his side, the understandable loneliness of a widower who wanted company in the evenings, and, on Lady Cecily's side, the equally understandable calculation of a widow who wanted a household to preside over. The arrangement had suited both parties for some years. It had suited Margaret rather less, but she was not the party whose preferences had been consulted. Her father had left debts. This was the fact that governed everything now. Not large debts, not debts of the operatic kind that ruined families overnight, but steady debts, accumulated quietly over several years of a solicitor's practice that had never quite recovered from a bad investment in 1827, and they amounted to a sum that required management. £800 was what Lady Cecily named them, in the particular tone she used when she named something she had decided was someone else's problem. The solution, in Lady Cecily's architecture, was Sir Neville Crabbe. Sir Neville was a merchant baronet, recently widowed, 50 years of age, with a house in Bristol, and an appetite for the kind of social elevation that a younger wife of good family could provide. He had been introduced to the Deering household the previous spring at a county assembly, and Lady Cecily had marked the introduction immediately for what it was. By September she had entertained him twice at dinner. By October she had received a letter, Margaret received the letter on a Tuesday morning, delivered to her at breakfast by Lady Cecily herself, which was unusual. Lady Cecily did not often deliver things personally. She sat across the table and watched Margaret read it with the expression of a woman who has solved a problem and expects gratitude. The letter was brief and clear. Sir Neville proposed a formal betrothal. He offered to settle the £800 of Deering household debt upon the marriage. He named a fortnight as a reasonable interval for the lady's consideration. The letter was written in a round commercial hand, and it addressed Margaret as if she were a property that had been appraised and found adequate. Margaret folded it along its original creases and set it beside her teacup. "You have a fortnight," Lady Cecily said. "I would advise you not to waste it in unnecessary deliberation." Margaret said she understood. She finished her tea. She carried the letter to her room, placed it in the drawer of her writing desk, under her father's old correspondence, and went out through the garden gate before Lady Cecily could think of anything further to say. The path through Ashford Park was cool and deeply familiar. The oaks along the upper drive had gone almost bare by that last week of October, and the light that came through them was thin and grey, and smelled of damp ground and something faintly mineral that meant frost before the week was finished. She walked the kitchen garden path because it was the one that took her farthest from the Deering gate and closest to the old estate wall, where the yew hedge muffled the sounds of the road, and she could think without being interrupted by the sounds of thinking. She was thinking about 14 days. She was still thinking about 14 days when she rounded the corner of the kitchen garden wall and found a man she did not know crouching beside the gate examining the latch. He straightened when he heard her. He was perhaps 30 years of age, with dark hair that needed cutting, and a coat that was clearly warm enough but clearly also not his own, a gamekeeper's coat of old brown wool that sat with a faint wrongness across his shoulders. His hands were the hands of someone who had been working, or something close enough to it. He looked at her with an attention that was not rude, not startled, simply complete. "I beg your pardon," he said. His voice was low and even. "I did not hear you on the path." "The ground is soft today," Margaret said. "I usually come this way. I hope I'm not intruding." He considered this. "I believe the intruding is mutual." It was a dry remark, and she appreciated it, and she gave him the small, honest acknowledgement of it that it deserved. She asked if he was helping Mrs. Howell with the kitchen garden before winter. He said something non-committal, which she took for yes. She mentioned that the south-facing wall's mortar needed attention before the first hard freeze, a thing she had noticed herself on the previous week's walk, and he noted it with the kind of attention that suggested he would actually do something about it, which distinguished him immediately from most of the occasional labourers the estate hired. They parted without exchanging names. She walked home in the grey afternoon light and said nothing about the encounter because there was nothing to say about it, a man working at a gate she passed twice a week. She would not have thought further about it if she had not, that same evening, mentioned to Lady Cecily that the groundskeeper seemed to have acquired an assistant, and Lady Cecily had replied, without looking up from her embroidery, that she believed the estate had hired no one new, and that Margaret should not make conversation with servants regardless. Margaret went to bed and thought about 14 days again. She thought about Sir Neville's round commercial hand, and the precise phrasing of adequate consideration, and the £800 that stood between Lady Cecily's comfort and a kind of financial reckoning that Margaret was not entirely sure Lady Cecily had prepared herself to face. She thought about her father's desk, which was now in the corner of what had been his study and was now Lady Cecily's sitting room, and about his handwriting on the letters in her drawer, which was nothing like Sir Neville's. She did not sleep well. The following Thursday she brought water from the kitchen garden's well to the man in the too large coat, because it was a cold morning, and he had been working at the wall section she had mentioned, and she had passed the well on her way, and the bucket was there. It was not a complicated action. She set the bucket near him, said it was cold enough to make the mortar work harder, and he looked at the bucket and then at her with the same complete, unrued attention as before, and thanked her in 2 words. She noted his hands again, the cleanliness of his nails despite the morning's work, and then noticed she had noticed it, and continued along the path. That was the 2nd time. The rain came on the 3rd meeting 2 days later, arriving with the sudden authority of late October in Wiltshire. She was 20 minutes from the Deering Gate, and the path through the park was the shorter way home, and the man was at the east end of the upper path near the estate wall when the weather dropped. He had no coat. The gamekeeper's brown wool was bundled under his arm against a wall feature she presumed he had been inspecting. She gave him her own outer coat without significant deliberation. It was the work coat, a charcoal wool her father had made for the autumn, cut too large because he had bought it during a period of general optimism that had not quite materialized. It fit the stranger better than it had ever fit her. She told him the path to the estate's dry cellar entry was 30 yards to the left if he wanted shelter, and that she knew the way home well enough to manage it without one. He stood in the rain with her father's coat across his arm and looked at her for a moment longer than the situation required. "Miss," he said and paused, and she had the feeling that he had started a sentence he then decided to approach from a different direction. "I am in your debt." "It is a coat," she said. "Return it when the weather improves." She walked home in the rain and arrived at the Deering Gate thoroughly wet and warmer than she had any right to be. She did not know then that Mrs. Howell had observed the exchange from the kitchen garden window, or that Mrs. Howell had spent 30 years working for the Ashford estate and knew its owner's face with a clarity that no coat or casual working dress could obscure. She did not know that Mrs. Howell had pursed her lips in the particular way she had when something confirmed what she had already suspected, and returned to her bread with the quiet satisfaction of a woman who has been patient long enough to be proven right. Margaret did not know any of this. She knew only that Lady Cecily was waiting inside with a question about whether Margaret had reached her decision, and that Margaret said she had not yet reached a decision, and that Lady Cecily's expression shifted in the small, cold way it did when the outcome of something had already been determined and the other party had simply not been informed. The estate office was in the north wing of Ashford Park, its window facing the kitchen court, its door accessible by a short passage from the hall's service entry. Margaret had been inside it once, years ago with her father, when some document related to the estate's local tenancy arrangements had required his presence. She had no reason to visit it now, and she had not intended to visit it on the afternoon she found herself walking past it on the way to the estate's old library. The library was something she had been permitted in childhood to use. Her father's connection to the estate had extended that far. No one had ever told her she was no longer permitted, and so she had continued, at intervals, to visit it, to borrow the odd volume she could not find elsewhere. Mrs. Howell knew she came and had never locked the library door against her. It was one of the quiet arrangements that held the world together without anyone naming them. The estate office door was not fully closed. It was open perhaps 3 inches, perhaps 4, which was enough for voices to carry into the passage. She recognized Lady Cecily's voice first, the particular register of it, the one that sat higher in the throat, the one that meant she was performing certainty for someone she was not entirely certain of. "The terms are satisfactory," Lady Cecily said. "Sir Neville has been generous. The settlement clears the debt entirely, and the property arrangements are clean." A man's voice replied. Margaret did not know it. She stood in the passage and breathed very carefully. "And the girl," the man's voice said, "is in agreement?" Lady Cecily paused. It was a small pause, the kind that lasts no longer than the decision to relocate a fact. "Her feelings are not relevant," Lady Cecily said. "She will comply. She understands her position." Margaret stood in the passage with her hand near the library door handle. The fire in the estate office crackled once. The man's voice said something about the legal instruments, and Lady Cecily said that she would have them ready. And Margaret turned her hand on the library door handle and went inside, and closed the door very gently behind her, and stood with her back against it in the smell of old paper and dry oak shelving until the sound of her own breathing steadied. She understood her position. She had always understood her position. She was the 23-year-old daughter of a dead country solicitor whose household carried £800 of debt, and whose stepmother had decided that the simplest instrument for resolving that debt was a marriage contract with a Bristol baronet who had addressed her as though she were a line in a ledger. She understood all of this with perfect clarity. What she had not understood until Lady Cecily said it in the voice of a woman speaking a settled fact was that there was no room in Lady Cecily's architecture for her to be a person who might feel differently about it. Her feelings were not relevant. She sat in the library's old reading chair for a long time. The room was quiet. The shelves held their volumes in the October dark without any particular concern for her distress, which she found steadying. She was not, she told herself, surprised. She was simply possessed now of information she had not had before, and information could be used. A sound at the library door. She looked up. He stood in the doorway with her father's coat folded over his arm. The library's low fire lit the room unevenly, and in that light the coat's charcoal wool looked almost black, and his face was composed in the particular way she had come to recognize from 3 encounters on the paths, that quality of attention which took everything in and returned very little. "Mrs. Howell said I might find you here," he said. He set the coat on the reading table between them. He did not sit. He stood with his hands at his sides and looked at her with the careful attention she had received 3 times now, and on this occasion she noticed that it was not the attention of someone looking at a problem. It was the attention of someone who has been paying a debt of their own, quietly, across several meetings. "Thank you," she said, "for returning it." "Thank you," he said, "for the loan of it." She almost asked him his name. She stopped herself because asking would have changed the nature of the space between them, and she was not certain she was ready for that change, and because some part of her had the irrational sense that names would close off a door, she was not yet finished walking through. He stayed perhaps 20 minutes. He looked at the shelves. She sat in the chair. They spoke about the library, and then about the estate grounds, and then about the particular difficulty of late-season masonry work in Wiltshire clay soil, which was not a conversation she could have had with Sir Neville Crabbe in any configuration of the universe she could imagine. When he went, he paused at the door. "The south gate latch has been fixed," he said. "I thought you should know since you mentioned it." She said that she was glad to hear it. He went. She sat in the library for another quarter-hour with her hand resting on the folded coat, and then she went home and took out Sir Neville's letter from her father's drawer and read it twice, and took out a clean sheet of paper and began to write. The refusal took 4 drafts. She wrote the first one in the heat of the afternoon's overheard exchange, which made it precise and rather cold, and said everything she meant, but said it in a voice that Lady Cecily would recognize as anger and, therefore, dismiss. The second draft was too conciliatory. The third draft was nearly right, but contained a sentence about her own qualifications for managing a household that drifted, she decided, into unnecessary argument. The fourth draft was brief. It declined Sir Neville's proposal. It cited no reasons that could be negotiated. It was signed in her clearest hand with her full name, Miss Margaret Deering, which was the name she had been given and which she had no intention of exchanging for anything Sir Neville Crabbe could offer. She sealed it herself. She addressed it herself. She sent it with the Daily Post the following morning, handing it to the boy who collected from the Deering gate before Lady Cecily had come down to breakfast. The next 4 days were not comfortable. Lady Cecily received word from Sir Neville's secretary that a refusal had been received. Lady Cecily's response to this information was delivered in the morning room at 11 o'clock, with the full structural force of someone who has arranged a world to a particular set of specifications and returned to find it altered without permission. Margaret stood near the window and kept her hands still, and listened to everything Lady Cecily said about ingratitude and position and the obligation of daughters to families they had not bankrupted themselves. She did not interrupt. She did not argue. She said, when Lady Cecily finally stopped, that she was sorry to have caused distress, and that her decision was firm. Lady Cecily said that Margaret would find her position in this household considerably less comfortable as a result. Margaret said she understood. She went to the estate that afternoon because there was nowhere else in her known world that felt sufficient, and because she wanted to see the south gate latch that had been repaired, and because she was honest enough with herself to acknowledge that she also wanted to see the man who had repaired it, though she could not have explained in any language Lady Cecily would accept why his presence on those grounds had become, over the course of 2 weeks, the thing she most reliably found steadying. The estate was quiet. She walked to the library on her own. She read for an hour. She was deep in a collection of natural history essays, one of several volumes the estate held that she had not been able to find elsewhere when she heard a footfall in the passage outside, and Mrs. Howell appeared in the doorway with a tea tray. She had never, in all her years of visiting this library, been brought tea. Mrs. Howell set the tray on the reading table with the efficiency of a woman who has made 30 years of decisions about what is appropriate and intends to be questioned about none of them. She was a small, precise woman of perhaps 60, with grey hair put up very neatly, and the kind of stillness about her that came from long practice of watching people without their knowing. She poured the tea. She straightened the sugar. She looked at Margaret with the faint, dry warmth of someone who has formed an opinion and declined to deliver it aloud. "Will you be walking the upper path before dark?" she asked. Margaret said she thought she might. Mrs. Howell nodded in the manner of someone confirming a fact they already held. She took the tray handles in her hands without taking the tray, and said, almost as a side observation, that the upper path was particularly good at this time of year, on account of the view from the east wall where one could see the whole south drive. Then she took the tray away. Margaret sat with her tea and thought about that for a moment before she understood what it was that Mrs. Howell had just told her. She took the upper path. The afternoon light was low and very gold, the way it went in late October just before it gave up entirely, lying flat across the open ground between the east wall and the home wood. She reached the point where the path opened onto the view of the south drive, and she saw the south drive was occupied. A horseman, a second man on foot, in the livery of a courier service, and he was addressing the horseman with the ease of someone who has found the exact person he was looking for. She could not hear the words at first. She came closer along the wall's verge, keeping to the hedge shadow because the instinct for it was simply there, not from deception, but from the old habit of a woman who moves through other people's spaces carefully. She heard the courier say something about the estate's London correspondence and quarterly accounts. She heard him say the words his lordship's instructions. She heard him say, in the straightforward way of a man completing an errand. "My lord." The horseman was the man from the kitchen garden. He was on his own horse now, a horse that suited him considerably better than the gamekeeper's coat had suited him, a bay gelding of good quality, and he sat it with the ease of someone who had done this since childhood. He received the packet of correspondence the courier offered. He said something brief, and the courier bowed and turned his horse back toward the road. Margaret stood at the wall's verge, with the gold afternoon light on her face and the east wind in her ears, and she understood, with a completeness that had no room in it for surprise, everything she had been looking at for the past 14 days. The lit windows at midnight, the man in the too large coat, the way he examined the gate latch not as someone hired to fix it, but as someone with a direct and personal interest in whether it held, the library, the quiet attention, the repaired mortar, the returned coat, the 20 minutes of conversation about the estate's clay soil spoken in the voice of a man who knew exactly whose soil it was. She walked home. She walked home because there was nothing else immediate to do, and because she needed to walk, and because she was 23 years old and had just understood something that reorganized the recent past with a thoroughness that required the physical counterweight of movement. She was not frightened. She was not, she thought, even embarrassed. She was something more particular than either of those, a sensation of having been very carefully observed for 2 weeks by someone who had not announced themselves, and of having, under that observation, done nothing she would not do again. The following morning began as an ordinary morning and became, very quickly, something else. Lady Cecily was at breakfast before her, which was unusual, and Sir Neville Crabbe was seated beside her at the table, which was more unusual still. He had apparently arrived the previous evening and been installed in the Deering household's best spare room without Margaret's knowledge, and he sat now with his watch-chain and his satisfied expression, and Lady Cecily said, with the smooth authority of someone who has arranged the room to her own advantage, that Margaret should sit down, because there was a matter to resolve before the morning got further along. Margaret sat down. She poured her own tea. She looked at Sir Neville, who looked at her in the manner of a man who regards a complication that has been explained to him as already resolved. "You sent a refusal," Lady Cecily said. That refusal was, I am sorry to say, not authorized and not binding. I have spoken with Sir Neville and he has agreed to overlook it. The letter of settlement will be signed this afternoon. Margaret set her cup down. She said, very levelly, that she had written the refusal herself, sealed it herself, and sent it herself, and that she would not be signing any letter of settlement this afternoon or any other afternoon. Lady Cecily said that Margaret was a minor under her guardianship, and that the matter was not open for further discussion. Margaret said, equally levelly, that she had not been a minor since her 21st birthday, and that Lady Cecily's guardianship had no legal instrument behind it that she was aware of, and that she would be very interested to hear what Sir Neville's solicitor would say about a marriage contract executed without the subject's consent. Sir Neville's expression shifted. It was a small shift, the kind that meant a man was revising the arithmetic of a situation. Lady Cecily's expression shifted too, in the harder way, the way that meant she was moving from one approach to another. She was still moving from one approach to another when the sound of a carriage on the Deering Gate gravel reached the morning room, and Mrs. Howell appeared at the morning room door, which she had never in Margaret's memory done, uninvited, and said in the voice of a woman who has done this before in a different household and intends to do it correctly, that the Earl of Ashford had arrived and was asking if Lady Cecily would receive him in the great hall of the estate house at his earliest opportunity. The morning room went very still. Lady Cecily said slowly, "The Earl." Mrs. Howell confirmed it. She did not elaborate. She waited. The party assembled at the Ashford Great Hall consisted of Lady Cecily, who had walked the South Drive with the speed of a woman, recalculating every social variable simultaneously; Sir Neville, who had come because he did not know whether to come and could not bear not to; and Margaret, who had come because she had walked this ground since childhood and intended to continue walking it without asking permission. He was already there. He stood near the fireplace in his own coat, a coat that fit him properly, dark wool and well cut, and he looked like what he was, in a way he had not looked, on the kitchen garden path, like anything other than a man attending to a gate latch. Mrs. Howell stood to his left. He held no papers and made no formal display of anything. He simply stood in his own hall and let the room understand. Lady Cecily recovered herself with the speed of someone who has spent decades performing composure. She made a very correct curtsy and addressed him as my lord, which was 3 weeks late and several conversations too modest, and managed none of this inaccuracy from her expression. Edward looked at her with the same attention he had given everything else, the complete and unreadable attention. And then he looked at Sir Neville, who was performing the particular social acrobatics of a man who arrived for one purpose and must now present himself for another, and who bowed with the energy of someone trying to establish a favourable position before the terms were announced. "I understand," Edward said, "that there is an arrangement under discussion involving Miss Deering." Lady Cecily said there was a private family matter, yes, and that she did not wish to trouble his lordship with it. He said he was not troubled. He said he would be obliged if Lady Cecily would confirm the nature of the settlement that had been sought. Lady Cecily said it was simply a matter of a betrothal. She named the sum. £800 to settle the late Mr. Deering's household accounts. She said it quite smoothly, as though she were describing an arrangement too reasonable to examine. He looked at the room for a moment. "Miss Deering," he said. Margaret, who had been standing at the window with her hands still, turned. "I have been reviewing the estate accounts," he said, "and the records of my late steward's tenancy agreements. Your father, I find, performed some years of good service to this estate's legal management, for which he was never adequately compensated at the time. I intend to make that right." It was stated plainly, without flourish, in the voice she had come to know on the kitchen garden path. Sir Neville's watch chain gleamed. He looked at Lady Cecily. Lady Cecily looked at Sir Neville. The social architecture they had spent 3 weeks constructing was not collapsing dramatically. It was simply becoming irrelevant, the way a prepared argument becomes irrelevant when the meeting is cancelled before it begins. Sir Neville said something about congratulations on his lordship's return to the county. He said it in the voice of a man making an exit, and he made the exit. And Mrs. Howell went with him as far as the hall door, which she closed behind him with a precision that was not quite a comment. Lady Cecily remained. She stood near the fireplace with her hands clasped, and her expression doing something complicated that resolved, eventually, into a correctness she was too practiced to abandon even now. "My lord," she said, "I was not aware of any outstanding matter between the estate and Mr. Deering's affairs." He said she was perhaps not. She said more carefully that she had of course only wished to see Margaret well settled. He looked at Lady Cecily with the complete attention. He said nothing for a moment long enough that Lady Cecily had to make a small adjustment in her posture. "Miss Deering will be very well settled," he said. "She has been for some time, I think." The difficulty was a question of who had noticed. Lady Cecily had no available response to this. She made her second curtsy of the morning, considerably more careful than the first, and she left the great hall with the bearing of a woman who has not been defeated, precisely, but who has understood that the room she was performing for has changed its mind about what it is watching. The hall was quiet when she was gone. Mrs. Howell reappeared with the efficiency of long practice, confirmed that the carriage was being attended to and that rooms could be made ready if required, and then observed, with the dry brevity that served her in all seasons, that the south gate latch appeared to have been very properly repaired, and that the kitchen garden would be the better for it. Then she withdrew. The fire in the hall hearth settled. Margaret stood by the long windows, with the afternoon light behind her, and looked at the man who had spent 3 weeks mending walls on his own estate in someone else's coat. And she thought about the south gate and the old library and the rain on the upper path. And she thought about the 14 days that had seemed, for a fortnight, like a closing door. And she said, because she had never found any advantage in performing things she was not. "You might have told me." He looked at her. His mouth moved in the particular way she had seen once before, in the library, when he had started a sentence and chosen a different direction. "I wanted to know," he said, "what you were like when you did not know." She turned that over for a moment. "And?" she said. "Exactly," he said, "as I had hoped." She looked at him for a long moment, and then she looked at the hall around her, the stone floor, and the old hearth and the ceiling that had been here since before either of them was born, and she felt something that was not triumph and not relief, though it had elements of both, but was more specifically the particular warmth of standing in a place that has decided to keep you in front of the person whose deciding makes the room make sense. She went to the library afterward because it was the library, and because it was hers in the way a place becomes yours through long acquaintance and honest use, and the particular understanding that some spaces know you back. The fire had been lit there too, either by Mrs. Howell's instruction or by some household instinct that knew where she would go. The shelves held their volumes in the late afternoon quiet. The reading chair was where she had left it. And on the reading table, folded along its original creases with the care of something returned to its proper place, was her father's old charcoal coat. She touched it once, running her fingers along the wool's worn collar where October rain had darkened it and the grain had dried slightly rough. Behind her, from the doorway, came a sound of a footfall she now knew well, deliberate and unhurried. She did not turn immediately. She let the library hold the moment for one breath longer in the dry smell of old oak and open pages and the low, warm certainty of a room that had waited for her a long time. Then she turned.